What the Hopi elders knew about the tunnels under the Grand Canyon was never meant to be public. In 1909, a newspaper published a report about a hidden tunnel system inside the canyon. Not natural, but engineered, with straight corridors carved into rock, leading into chambers filled with mummies, statues, and artifacts that don't match any known civilization in that region. The report wasn't vague. It gave exact locations, distances, even how the entrance was reached high up in the canyon wall, only accessible by rope, and the discovery wasn't random. It was made by a government surveyor reportedly working with the Smithsonian. So this wasn't just a story, it was documented, and then it was denied, fast, completely. The Smithsonian stepped in and said, none of it existed. No explorer, no expedition, no tunnels, nothing. And that's where it stops making sense, because fake stories don't get that kind of reaction. They get ignored. This didn't. This was shut down immediately, which means something in that report wasn't supposed to stay public. So I looked into it, not just the article, but everything around it. And the deeper I went, the more it stopped looking like a mistake and started looking controlled. Because there was another group connected to this who should have ended the story instantly if it was false. The Hopi. They've lived around that canyon for generations. They know that land better than any surveyor ever could. If the tunnels didn't exist, they would have said it. If the story was fake, they would have dismissed it, but they didn't. They stayed silent, not just in 1909. That silence goes back much further, and it continues long after. And that kind of silence doesn't come from not knowing. It comes from knowing something and choosing not to say it. Now think about that. One side denies everything, the other refuses to speak. Different reactions. Same result. The truth stays hidden. So this isn't about whether the tunnels existed. It's about why something detailed enough to be published was erased and never properly investigated, and why the only people who might have confirmed it chose not to, because at some point, this stops being a story and starts becoming a pattern. Something gets discovered, it gets documented, and then it disappears. So the real question isn't about the tunnels, it's about what was inside them that made one side erase it and the other protect it with silence. Because the tunnels weren't the secret. What was inside them was. So what exactly was described inside those tunnels is where things stop being normal and start getting uncomfortable. According to the 1909 report, the entrance wasn't something you would casually find. It was cut into the canyon wall, hundreds of feet above the river, in a location that would require deliberate effort to reach. Not a natural cave opening, not erosion, but something placed where it wouldn't be seen unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, the first thing described was structure, not rough passages, not irregular caves, but corridors, straight lines, angles, direction, the kind of layout that suggests planning, not formation. The main passage reportedly extended deep into the rock, with chambers branching off on both sides. And inside those chambers is where the report becomes difficult to ignore, because they didn't find empty space. They found objects, mummies, placed in carved wall niches, not scattered, not buried, but positioned deliberately. That alone is unusual for the region. But it didn't stop there. There were statues, not broken fragments, not primitive carvings, but detailed figures. And according to the description, they didn't resemble anything typically associated with Native American cultures of that area. Some were described as having features closer to what you would expect from ancient Asian or even Egyptian representations. That comparison wasn't added later. It was in the original report. And then there were the markings, tablets, symbols, carvings that looked structured, almost like a written system, but not one that matched anything officially recognized in North American archaeology. Now pause for a second and think about what that means. You're not just talking about tunnels anymore. You're talking about a fully organized underground space with placement, design, and objects that suggest intention. That doesn't happen randomly. That requires a system, a group, a purpose, and that's exactly where the official story breaks down. Because if even a small part of this was real, it wouldn't have been ignored. It would have been one of the most important discoveries in American history. Instead, it vanished. No follow-up expedition, no official survey, no recovered artifacts placed in museums. Nothing. Which is strange, because even minor findings in the Grand Canyon have been studied for decades. But this, something this large, this structured, this detailed, completely disappears. That's not lack of interest. That's removal. And this is where it gets even more specific. The report didn't describe a random layout. It mentioned directional alignment, passages running in organized patterns, almost as if the entire space was designed with a system in mind. That's not how natural caves behave. That's how constructed environments behave. So now the question shifts again, not just what was found, but who built it. Because whoever created something like that wasn't just passing through. They were established, organized, capable. And that doesn't fit into the accepted history of that region. Which brings us back to the reaction. Immediate denial, no investigation, no recovery, and the only detailed description we have, locked inside a single report from 1909. So either this was one of the biggest archaeological discoveries ever made, or it was something that needed to disappear before anyone else could see it. And that's when it stopped looking like an isolated event, because discoveries like this don't just vanish once, they follow a pattern. What happened in 1909 doesn't look isolated when you step back and look at it properly, because the sequence is always the same. Something gets discovered, it gets documented, and then it disappears, not ignored, removed. And once you start noticing that pattern, you see it in more than one place. Reports surface, details get published, and then institutions step in and shut it down before it turns into something bigger. That's not random, that's controlled. And when you look at who has the ability to do that, it always points in the same direction. Government-backed institutions, scientific organizations, groups that decide what becomes official history and what gets labeled as a mistake, which means this was never just about tunnels, because if it was only about tunnels, it would have been studied, catalogued, measured, explained. That's what science does, but that didn't happen here. Instead, it was denied completely. So the question changes again, not what was found, but why was it removed? And when you look at the time this happened, the answer starts to take shape. Early 1900s. The American Southwest was being reorganized, mapped, and controlled. Land was being claimed. Territories were being turned into federal property. The Grand Canyon itself was moving toward becoming a national monument, then a national park. That process depends on one thing: control of the narrative. Because once land becomes public heritage, everything connected to it gets redefined. Its history, its ownership, its meaning. Now imagine something like that tunnel system being confirmed publicly at that exact time. An underground complex, structured, organized, possibly built by a civilization not recognized in official history. That changes everything. It raises questions about who was there before, what existed before, and who actually has claim to that land. That's not just history anymore. That's a problem. And problems like that don't get studied. They get removed. Now bring the Hopi back into this, because this part matters. They didn't discover this in 1909. They already knew something was there. Their traditions talk about emergence from below, about specific locations in the canyon connected to what they consider the origin point. That's not new information. That existed long before any newspaper article. So when that report came out, it wasn't revealing something unknown to them. It was exposing something they had already chosen not to share. And that changes how you look at their silence. They weren't confused. They weren't unsure. They were deliberate, because from their perspective, making something like that public wouldn't protect it. It would expose it. And once something like that becomes public, it doesn't stay in the hands of the people who understand it. It gets studied, classified, removed, and turned into something else, something controlled. So their silence wasn't about hiding the truth. It was about protecting it. And that's the part most people miss. They weren't hiding it from us. They were protecting it from us. Because once something becomes public, it doesn't stay sacred. It gets taken. So what does that leave us with right now? The Grand Canyon is one of the most studied places in the world, and at the same time, large parts of it have never been properly explored. Most of the surveys focus on accessible areas, the rim, the known paths, the places people can reach without effort, the deeper sections, the cliff walls, the locations described in that 1909 report. Those areas remain largely untouched. That alone should raise questions, because if something that detailed was reported, the logical response would have been to investigate it properly. Send teams, map the area, confirm or disprove it with evidence. That never happened. And that absence matters more than the original report. Because when something is false, investigation exposes it. When something is real, investigation confirms it. But when nothing happens at all, when there is no follow-up, no official attempt to even check, that's when it starts to look intentional. And if you look at it from that perspective, the situation hasn't really changed. The canyon is still there. The locations described are still there. The terrain hasn't disappeared. What's missing is access. Access controlled by permits, by regulations, by systems that decide where people can go and where they can't. And that doesn't prove anything on its own, but it does create a boundary between what is known publicly and what is left unexplored. Now combine that with everything else. A detailed report that gets denied immediately, a discovery with no follow-up, a region that remains partially unexplored, and a group of people who have consistently refused to speak about certain parts of it. That's not one gap in the story. That's multiple gaps pointing in the same direction. Something is incomplete. And the longer something stays incomplete, the more likely it is that it's being kept that way. So the question isn't whether the tunnels are still there. If they were described accurately even once, then they don't just disappear. The real question is whether anyone is actually allowed to find out. Because if something like that still exists, it wouldn't be sitting in plain view. It would be exactly where it was described, hidden in a place that requires effort, permission, and time to reach. And until that changes, the situation stays the same. A report that was denied, a location that was never fully checked, and a silence that still hasn't been broken. So maybe the better question isn't what was found in 1909. Maybe it's why, after more than a century, no one has been allowed to prove it wrong. And that's the part that keeps this from being just another story. Because if it was nothing, it would have been settled a long time ago, but it wasn't.